Okay, welcome to the pregame for Unfound on the Ground number 26. We have about 3 minutes before we get started. And I want to just, as usual, use this time to go ahead and get the tech checks in order and get a few things going on the chat that I utilize for reminders. If you're watching this video after it's released, after it's made, this pregame does make it to that distributed version. That's okay. And so I'm going ahead and asking you to like or share this video if you're so inclined. And if you're not a subscriber to Unfound, the channel here on YouTube for the Unfound podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. But definitely go ahead and like. Hello, Kathy. How are you? Thanks for coming here a little bit early for the pregame as I'm getting things set up. And so this is Unfound on the Ground number 26, the disappearance of the Roanoke colonists. We have about 2 minutes till we officially get started. But again, this pregame's on the video. This just makes me enable that our digital tech environment here is set up and get some of the things going that I like to always reference, including the website, the unfoundpodcast.com. Of course, Unfound is active on Facebook and elsewhere on the web. So the center location for that, of course, is the website, the unfoundpodcast.com. So if you're watching this video at some point, bookmark and visit that site. It's a great resource overall. Obviously, you're keeping up on the goings-on of Unfound. But there's good resources there. Some resources from past episodes of Unfound on the Ground. Yes, of course, I'm behind still in updating those. Of course, they're here in our chat stream. But there's resources. One of the things that Unfound's about, and certainly I try to push, is resource sharing for the public and for those of us who are involved. Of course, our think tank members, premium members of a certain level, go ahead and participate in the making of this episode. And going forward, and it is time to start. So it is 6:15 Mountain Time, 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Eric Grabowski is my name. I am the host here of Unfound on the Ground, part member of the assisting team there for the Unfound podcast, run by Ed Densel. Hello, Carol. Again, hello to Kathy. And this episode is the disappearance of the Roanoke colonists, episode 26. And I am primarily, what I do is I'm a communication professor, but on the side, I do some cold case journalism and happy to be involved with Unfound and its great efforts. As I often give the disclaimer, my views don't necessarily represent those of my employing institution. Feel free to give any disclaimers you want to. I did put in the text, as usual, our general overview disclaimers for these episodes because we build these, we make these, and then they get distributed in the future. This is episode 26, the disappearance of the Roanoke colonists. We're recording video and audio, including the text chat. Chat participation is an option. For the journalistic, promotional, and commercial purposes of Unfound, the audio and video recording, including text chat, of this digital meeting will be distributed by Unfound. By participating in the digital meeting, you agree to give Unfound your permission to use the rendering of your words for journalistic, promotional, and or commercial purposes, with no compensation to you from Unfound, its assistants, its affiliates, its partners, etc. As always, please visit, and I've posted it here, theunfoundpodcast.com. Hello, Marty. Welcome to the making of an Unfound on the Ground episode. So tonight we're going through the disappearance of the Roanoke colonists, certainly through media or through your own reading of history or through a history class that you might have had at one point in time in high school or college. We have this lingering mystery here in the good old USA and really for the New World broadly and the North American continent. Of course, involves the push westward by the Europeans, particularly the English in this case, as well as the ongoing, diplomacy, turmoil, and at times getting along with the Native American Indian peoples of the continent, who were, of course, here. And so this story sort of becomes one prism or historical crossroads to think about it. But we are dealing with missing persons. And so I did distribute some preliminary sources, and I'll just go ahead and reference those really quick. There was that Encyclopedia Virginia.org entry on the Roanoke colonies, which does get into the disappearance eventually, but also with some important background material that's important for the region and some of the exploration that would happen. And I did share with the think tank folks the In Search Of episode from the History Channel pertaining to the lost colony of Roanoke. Of course, I'm sharing it here also. Now, according to, and I'm not going to share this, I'll just reference it, the history.com website, right, for the History Channel. That episode came out in 2019. Still relatively current, still has some important perspectives in it, which will be mentioning. It's also a very helpful overview of the story and some of the questions or controversies. Again, I'm going to give some of my usual disclaimer here that I'm not going to endorse any particular view. This is some fascinating but interesting history with controversy. So we know that, what do we know? What don't we know? And then, of course, what are some of the message? Carrie, thank you. I'm here for a bit anyway. Hello, friends. Hello, Carrie. Reading from Kathy, I read through the wiki about this topic 2 weeks ago, and it was so extensive, hundreds of names, but the program you posted helped me a lot. Yeah, it is helpful. There's a ton of material in the lead up. And you did remind me, again, we're cautious with Wikipedia, although there is some true information on there and references. But since folks do reference it, even at time with some of these entries, if there's not adequate editorial review and people do read it, I will post it here with those usual disclaimers. There's a lot to it, but it's fascinating. So the key dates to think about here for thinking through the Roanoke colonists, and that sometimes referred to as the disappearance of what happened to the Roanoke colony. And we're focusing on the disappearance of the Roanoke colonists. Right, it's the same, but focusing on the people. You know, the key dates here are 1587 to 1590, and this is one of those explorations or trips that were sponsored by Sir Walter Raleigh. Now, this Roanoke Island area is off of what would today be North Carolina, and but certainly part of that attempt by English folk to establish a first permanent colony settlement in the area. It certainly wasn't the first attempt at exploration. And some of the material we're sharing gets into that. And of course, it's, as we'll see, and if you watch the History Channel video or read some of the other material, understanding that background might be very important to understanding what happened happened to these folks. It's an interesting journey back that involves geography, archaeology, genealogy, right? That's something that we're interested in. Even some of the geopolitical dynamics of the time in terms of the trips of this and other voyages, these and other voyages. History, we could even talk about how anthropology and study of language and linguistics and cultures play a role and so forth. The time frame, of course, important to consider. We have that John White, Governor John White, who would be, governor there in terms of being put in charge of this area or this colony region through earlier exploration and forward, was basically in charge of this trip that there would arrive there in 1587. And we had about 100 and some colonists. And I have here, and I found, because the names are important, this page here, this nps.gov page, and you can scroll down to the 1587 colonists, and you will, okay, Marty, Roanoke has always intrigued me. It's incredibly intriguing, no doubt. In terms of some of the documented names, now the nps.gov, of course, being a federal government entity, certainly you would think, and pretty much we know, in terms of consulting with historians and other archivists and researchers, are consistently looking at material, but not knowing when exactly that page was last reviewed. I'll say it's probably generally or fairly accurate. One name that you'll sometimes hear is important historically with regard to this voyage, and that's the name Virginia Dare. And of course, Virginia Dare was a granddaughter of this John White. She was also the first English child born in the New World. And I shared the North Carolina Museum of History link talking about Virginia Dare's birthday, ncmuseumofhistory.org. Obviously, you'll see that discussion of Virginia Dare elsewhere. But of course, that of the group of the colonists who disappeared, she and family and others would be part of that. Kathy, amazing how a few people have devoted their lives to try and solve the mystery of Roanoke. Yes, absolutely. And we'll get into some of that. There's some pretty, regardless of what you think of some of the theories and debates that you find on the History Channel site and elsewhere, there are some key people, and I mentioned those various discipline areas of study. There are some key people that are part of that mix, and some of them from that region and beyond. Well, as you know, folks, as I always say, for a lot of these cases that we study or that Ed features or other cases, right, someone out there knows something or knows someone who knows something. Well, this one I can say we're probably forward enough in time to say someone out there knew something or knew someone who knew something. Of course, when we get into some of the archaeological and even the genealogical research, which is part of that, tracing that back becomes interesting. We don't have directly from that time really Governor John White's accounts, his information. Obviously, there's some contextual materials from before, during, and after that are helpful in terms of putting things together. So when White returned, so in 1587 to 1590, again, that's your key time range. So he went back after this arrival and establishment in 1587, went back to England for supplies. Yeah, Marty, good point. That's part of what is intriguing, is the passion, focus, and insight that people bring to this. So he went back to England and for some governance or political, commercial reasons that I won't get into the details here, but came back to the island later than intended. So he was there by 1590. And when he arrived back, those colonists were gone. And the houses that they had built were taken down. And, the different accounts you get, there were two things. And of course, this is something that they're relying on his documentation from him. On a tree, the letters CRO were there. And then on a palisade or on a post, the word Croatan was inscribed. Of course, that in that region, of course, some discussion, and we'll get into this, the Croatan Native American Indians. Kathy, the genealogical research regarding Roanoke is fascinating. My little sister attended a conference in SLC last month, and the Y chromosome stuff was a topic, right? And of course, in the History Channel documentary, when they get into the work of that particular genealogical project, you actually, one of the benefits of this case, just learning it in a very general or a little bit more specific way, and you start to learn about, and that's what we're doing in these Unfound on the Ground, right? We're looking at these as case studies if one were to research more. And I guess another way to think about it, thank you, Kathy, is what can we learn more from it in general or in particular for other cases? And I've said here for myself, right, I want to learn more and more about the specifics of the DNA and so forth. And you do learn about how that works here and what they have to key into and so forth to accurately be able to trace out, especially this many 100 years later, how to think about location and ethnicity and potential relationships that would lead to for someone to say some or all of these folks went here or went here. So we will definitely get to that. If anyone else wants to chime in, please do as we're going along. So ultimately, big picture, if a lot of questions, and this is in the History Channel episode of In Search Of and in other sources that you would sort of sift through. Obviously, what happened, right? That's where did these people go? Or was there a split, right? Some went one way, some went another. That's something to keep in mind too, that some sources mentioned. And why did they leave? Right? What that's a key question that comes up. Obviously, as you'll see through some of the material here that we're looking at, that getting there in terms of this, some of this is highlighted in the aspects of this is highlighted in the History Channel video, right? Even getting there and some of the events that led them to even go to this Roanoke Island, as opposed, say, for instance, Chesapeake Bay area. Right? Was there a diversion in their course? Now, there's certainly some discussion of this in that video, and elsewhere you'll see the discussion of a Mr. Andy Gabriel Powell, who's considered as an expert in this field in terms of being sort of a go-to. I have not looked at any of his materials closely. But have definitely confirmed that he's someone who, just by some simple searches, that is an expert in this field, and he's someone, if one were to dig more deeply into this, again, he's featured on that history.com. I just shared a Google search. Certainly, if one wanted to look more into his work, he definitely has without necessarily endorsing here any one view of what ultimately happened to these folks. He's definitely part of that mix, and he's cited in their video. He's featured in the video. Kathy, it appears they may have left Roanoke because they weren't able to sustain themselves on that island. So that seems to be a very logical way and practical way of thinking of this. And then what gets really interesting, and this is in that History Channel video and elsewhere, is, let's just say for the sake of discussion, they made that decision. Part of what we're learning is why it's important to think about where they actually were. Were they, and this is where the geography and so forth comes into play. Understanding exactly where they were in relation from then till now, and establishing where they might even be able to find some of those remnants or artifacts of that. And then understanding that helps us understand, well, if the decision was about, hey, we're waiting for these supplies, or we're facing other sorts of things, well, where did they go? One of the, and this comes out in the video, is with the island itself, and we're right on that off the Carolina coast. Is it possible that an aspect of that island, through erosion and so forth, now they need to look at a different part of the island, more on the eastern part of the island. And one interesting group would definitely be an area that one would want to dig through more. They mentioned this Ann Poole and the Lost Colony Research Group. And with these folks, obviously some of their colleagues and the work they're doing, and volunteers hoping to figure out, with the use of just good old fashioned, man and woman power, and then also technology, to see what they can establish on the island. Well, that is, of course, gives us some perspective on where they would have gone after that. Did they go north or northwest? And I'm Albemarle Sound. Okay, we'll talk about that. Or did some or all of them go more south into the Hatteras Island area, which of course would have involved the Croatoan Indian folks, Native American folks. And so that understanding how that journey, especially to where we're again, when White found those inscriptions, right, on the tree and on the post, right, if some or all of them are traveling a certain way. Again, so it's important to understand where they were at, where they settled, from where they went, as the video said, on the move, and that provides a certain trajectory. Now, there's ongoing historical discoveries that end up going with that. We do see in the video, and it's helpful, and I had already looked at some .govs a little bit before that video. And again, as I always mention, you can use USA.gov, USA.gov, which is a helpful one for looking at. But in the video, they had a gentleman, a Mr. Nelson, park ranger. He's tied to that Fort Raleigh National History Site, and you can see by going to some of their material, and that helps ascertain. I mean, just from a history standpoint, I don't know, and anyone can chime in if they've ever actually been there. It would be sort of good to get that on a lifetime task list to get to this place. But just understanding that history, National Park Service material, and you can even see, and I just have if you were to go to their website, and you could just search their site, and I have the search here of things pertaining to the Lost Colony, and one in particular, and it mentions Park Ranger Josh, and you can just see ongoing discussion. I mean, this is a part of history. It would be very interesting to get there. And keep in mind, when you're working on some of these historic sites, you may know this from your own state, own part of the country. You have these historical sites, interpretive centers, all these ways that we engage history. Well, you're dealing with the lay of the land. You're dealing with history. You're working with historians. You're in conversation with community members, different things to make sure that information for the public is, to the extent possible, accurate and insightful. And then, of course, you're navigating what were the different possibilities to understanding that history. Of course, when we're dealing with what happened to these folks, so again, back to the history.com piece, History Channel, and as well as some of the other materials that are out there. Now, there is this discussion, if some or all of them went more north into this Albemarle Sound area, this would not have been a completely new endeavor in terms of knowing or understanding what might have been up there. Some of this goes back to the 2012 discovery of a map tied to John White, and that detailed exploration and not completely ascertained by him, but part of what he and others were gathering from previous exploration and information. And there was one or more sites that these folks could have made their way to. But some of the issues that come up about that is of course, diplomacy with Native American folks, some of that having more or less turmoil, as well as some other issues in the area. That's one way of thinking, that some or all of them went that way. Kathy, I'm wondering if the lost colony was not emphasized in my history classes in the 60s since I was in California. Very possible. Not a historian myself, but I know some, and of course, just knowing some about teaching college, and of course, those who teach in high school. You're trying to cover some sweep of national history, and then there's always that sense of what's important in terms of your region or your local area. So that's very much good a part of that. Carol, this is my first time hearing about this, and I'm from the South. Well, we're always learning things new. Believe me, I knew about this in the abstract. It's something that I sort of worked into the mix of possibilities, kind of lean towards it. There's things I'm learning here about that region. I've been down south. I've been to South Carolina, through North Carolina over the years, but don't recall ever being in this place, and it's certainly a place to go. So for sure. Now, if some, or Kathy, Carol, I didn't know about the lost colony either. So we're all learning. That's great. That's part of this. Again, if you're watching this now or later, folks, when this is distributed, don't forget to please consider like or share this video, along with subscribing to the channel if you have not already. Now, if some or all of those folks, colonists, went more south toward Hatteras Island, that, of course, goes to the view that some or all of them went toward the living more peacefully with the Croatoan Indians, Native American Indians. Now, there is a gentleman. Now, he is featured in this video. And he looks like he also has a book. And he's featured in the video. That's a Scott Dawson. If I recall, he's an archaeologist, and the archaeological material coupled with maybe some of this genealogical material, which we'll get to shortly, does lend some weight to this idea that the colonists, some or all of them, found a way to live with the Croatoan people. And so, again, I've not read the book, but it's definitely something I'm going to consider reading. And he is featured on that video. And so if one were to study this more closely, they would definitely want to at least consult that. I will say, too, like with learning, again, more about Sir Walter Raleigh, or learning more about the life of this John White, and some other explorers that just get named in this context of this region before, during, and after this whole Roanoke situation, incident, case, whatever you want to call it. Other names, there was a gentleman with the last name, can't remember the first name right now, but last name Lane, that was part of some of that earlier forward exploration. But when you start to just learning about the Croatoan people and the possibility that the English colonists spent time with them, which of course would have led to interactions and romances and coupling and relationships and families, right? So that's where the genealogy comes into play. Now, featured on the History Channel program and elsewhere, there is this Roberta Estes, who's a key person in the Lost Colony DNA project. And you saw in the History Channel episode a discussion that you can just, and I just shared the search of that. There's a number of references out there where this is being featured and discussed, and obviously they have we have as historical information about the people, many or all of the people who were on these expeditions, and of course they have through Native American and regional history, genealogy, archaeology, information about people who were living there. And of course, as she explains, right, if you understand this, and this is a sort of case study where you can learn more about the science of genealogy and DNA. And of course, she's bringing up this important point that there's aspects of this at DNA that can get us more closely to some sense of possible conclusiveness, as close as you can get. What happened to at least some of these people, right? It makes logical, inferential sense if you look at what you know and then what you're trying to figure out. That if you have some sort of genealogical information from those who were part of the exploring and colonist group, and then you have genealogical information tied to the Croatoan people, and you're finding people who have that crossover descendancy, now you're coming more close to the possibility of at least some of those folks finding their way to Hatteras Island and spending time with and living with the Croatoan people. Of course, again, remember when White went back in 1590, he found the tree, CRO on the tree, and Croatoan, the word Croatoan, on a post or palisade. Again, please continue to chime in as you have thoughts or preferences. And again, I'm not endorsing any one view here. Okay. So this, again, it is a fascinating walk through history. Anyway, I mean, just learning about someone like a Virginia Dare and how sort of the background of that and other things about the area. So, and I'll just, one of the organizations that's mentioned in the video, which is also interesting, and I'm just again going to put together a search string here for you. Obviously, it looks like they have their own website, but also some discussions about them, the Croatoan Archaeological Society, which would be important to understanding more about the area, and of course more about this case of missing persons, right? Missing persons. Okay. So again, the National Park Service material is very helpful, gives a lot of perspective on it. What do we know historically? What have we been able to discover over time? What do we see today? Obviously, when you talk about these areas, just like if you go to an important historic site in your own state, they work with archaeologists and historians and others to recreate, present what they can to the public. Obviously, this is where, again, not breaching the accuracy of it or the honesty to the public, but obviously both the presenters as well as the visitors, right? That's where we use our creative imagination to think, what might it have been like, or what was that like? That's part of historical learning, right? And so, but to get down to the brass tacks and to grapple with some of the um, aspects of what might have happened to these folks, right? That's where we have to navigate the various theories as regard to what would be the available facts, for sure. So again, one thing we can discuss in the chat, of course, is again what we kind of moved on here is what do we learn from it, but what are some of those other research areas that might be important? Of course, old maps become very important here. We've talked about mapping in the past. Obviously, historians and others are digging more deeply. You'll see in some of these discussions historical material that's been discovered or could be available between both England and the United States. Because remember, we're dealing with English explorers. I believe the 2012 map that was found was something discovered in England, I think. Kathy, interesting how the archaeologists can often date pieces of artifacts per what materials went into the artifacts. That is fascinating. And you see this in the History Channel video and elsewhere when they talk about things that are found on or near the island, the Roanoke Island. Also, things that they're looking at in one or more sites in the Albemarle Sound, as well as things that are on the Hatteras Island and nearby with regard to the Croatoan Indians and the possibility that the colonists went that way. And again, maybe there was a split too. That's brought up in some other material. You look at those artifacts and the people have the expertise through ongoing study, through documents, through science to be able to place it within a period of time. Oh, these are later, these are earlier, right? And then also, even with the pieces of things, what chemicals, and the gentleman who is the archaeologist that wrote the book, Scott Dawson, gets into this, right? What would have been sort of chemically or materially in something if, oh, this was English, or what would be that percentage mix if this was Croatoan? Well, in a sense, whether we're dealing with a crime or not per se here, but like with many disappearances we're getting into some of that same information that informs the forensic study, broadly speaking, of different sorts of things. So that's interesting. Kathy, one map shown in the program was vivid and well marked and labeled map found from the 16th century. Yes. And I'm reminded there of the map that was found later of that Albemarle Sound, that was important, and the possibility of what happened, and with regard to this history anyway. Okay, this history anyway. Okay, for sure. So and again, some of the other discussion, and as far as I could find, in terms of from the time the video was made to materials that are out there before, and you can see that through some of the Google links I shared and just some of the references in the Wikipedia, and again, always weighing those and just general searches to this point. Obviously, it's 2023 now, and folks have continued to use technology and so forth. This First Colony Foundation seems to be a group that is in the mix of various historical aspects of what we're talking about, not just the lost colony or the lost colonists. It's a good resource. It's definitely a resource that one would need to be onto. PBS North Carolina has done some ongoing featuring of important discussions and materials along those lines, and that's something I've toward the end of preparing for this episode, maybe a little on the front end, but found it, but needed to look at it a little bit more closely. And so those are material. And this is with some of these discussions, of course, that's where you get into some of the question of, was this all, ultimately, did all the colonists go one way or another, or could there have been a split, right? Might some have gone more towards the Sound, Albemarle Sound? Might others have gone more towards the Hatteras Island? Of course, in all that, right? In all that, moving one way or the other completely together or in a split, there's always that reality or possibility that along the way, some of those folks could have had illness, injury, death. I have not found anything that indicates that there's research of any sort of, that the John White material is your primary lead in, and then building the connections to things that are found around or found later from him or others. So that's important to keep in mind. The other nice thing about this, and this goes back to our discussions really early on in this series, we've talked about cultural dimensions, cross-cultural dimensions. We've talked about Native American, and we've talked about mainstream U.S. And now, as we go back in time, and I use that term, geopolitical aspects or implications, keep in mind, at the time of the English and their attempt to push forward into the New World, you're also dealing with a time when sort of the great world European superpowers, or at least we're dealing with England, we're dealing with Spain, and we know about those rivalries going back, and how even in the United States of America, what we now call the United States of America, if we're thinking about the North American continent in this region broadly, right, and through South America, right, we're dealing with obviously a range of Native American or indigenous folks who were living here, along with the push forward of the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French and the English and so forth. So just through the prism of this area, I think it's about 8 miles? Is that what some of the sources say? Again, if I'm not precise there, please forgive me. Building outward and learning through this prism of history, wondering what happened to these folks, right? Roberta Estes, when she's talking about this, she calls it the oldest cold case in America, right? The Roberta Estes of the Lost Colony DNA Project, right? We're interested, of course, through Unfound missing persons cases. We've looked at some cases, right, going back 50 and 100 years or whatever, but here we're going back to the 1500s, right, the 16th century, certainly, and you'll see this referenced in material with the forward movement of time and the forward movement of the development of the British and what would, moving towards what would become founded as the United States, and sort of the way in which people were maintaining or getting interested in this and maybe providing, I guess, some true and at times untrue, but maybe sincere ways of thinking about it, maybe sometimes call that mythical. Also, I found interesting is when Roberta Estes in the video was giving some of her overview, besides talking about the science, and this comes up in other sources too, probably, talking about the oral history that's out there. So people were recounting, claiming, talking about how this or that relative is somehow maybe tied to the Croatoan legacy and could have been maybe, I would love to see those oral history. I don't know if anyone's published them or that's just things she hears as involved in genealogy. That would be interesting to me. Frankly, I hadn't looked at for it yet. For sure. Kathy, I felt for John White. He went back to England, wasn't able to return for 3 years. Again, that's right, and had intended to come back sooner. By the time he got back to Roanoke, everyone was gone, including his relatives, right? Including his family, right? Including the parents of Virginia Dare. That's an important thing. We can't forget that human element of that, imagining what that would have been like for him, right? For him. There is And I want to just mention a name here that comes up, John Lawson, and I'm just mentioning it for ongoing research. He'd be someone who later interest in discussion of the lost colony through that forward movement of time that I'm talking about um, would be important. And in some ways, I guess he'd be considered influential. And let me just again share some of that. Keep that for your research. I read that, Kathy. This is Carol Ann. Hopefully, they were safe living near or with friendly Indians, and that's part of the discussion. And you can just see from that search some of that material about Lawson and his influence on our understanding a little bit later in time, right? Of the lost colony, for sure. And I have I don't know how much this website is kept up to date. I had seen it. It does seem on the front page relevant still. It is relevant anyway, and it seems like they're keeping up to things. And that's the lost dash or hyphen whatever colony.com, and getting into some of that forward movement in time on how we understand accounts of and so forth the lost colony. So you'll see that. So yeah, this John Lawson, a little bit later in time, into the 1700s, early 1700s, dealing with the question of the lost colony. Okay, for sure. Let's see if we got any other comments here. Well, that goes back, and again, what Carol Ann and Kathy are mentioning is the question of, and we know just from history and just reality and what we've learned, that there is the question of whether some or all of them ended up in a violent or dangerous situation with folks, Native American folks. If it would have been, again, the Croatoan people, for sure, it would have been potentially probably more tranquil. There is some discussion about the into the Albemarle Sound. The thinking is that there were some hostilities there, but it is possible, and you'll see that if you dig into that a little more deeply, that may have not always been the case, but definitely the Croatoan people would have been one that would have been more friendly. Okay, that would have been part of that. Okay, for sure. Other thoughts as we have about 15 minutes here. So if you have other thoughts or questions, as I move towards summarizing and winding down, there's a lot of fascinating material. I'm as some of you know, coming from a communication scholar and teacher, particularly for what we call rhetoric or rhetorical studies from a classical view, but thinking about contemporary things. And just me as a citizen, as well as someone who thinks about rhetoric and argumentation in public life. History is so important, right? So I'm not a historian, but I have to be attentive to history. And also to do just journalistically, any of these cold cases, there's a historical dimension, right? To do any sort of good journalistic work. It's fascinating. But even as a citizen, having care and concern about these people, what happened to these people, right? That's important for Unfound. But just then the paths to just so much more learning that goes with this. You'll often see some discussions of national geographic as part of this conversation. Of course, they're featuring some of the researchers, scholars, and so forth, some of which we've mentioned, and then some others. And obviously some, like in this and elsewhere, they're looking at the Roanoke situation in light of some of the other aspects of information that we have about settlements and colonies and whatever accounts we have. You'll see with these discussions in general across sources, not necessarily anyone particularly, that discussion of that map, that 2012 discovery of that map, which then gave folks more insight into what might have happened if some of these or all of these colonists went north. There is some skepticism about that. If I recall correctly, that Andy Gabriel Powell has raised some good questions about that approach. Of course, as you'll also see, although you're like, wow, there's really some good insights and information that thinks maybe it was the Croatoan people that they lived with and mixed with and had families with. But even there's some open questions, right? What do we know? What don't we know? Kathy, researching old disappearances can be very challenging. You have to think creatively. That's absolutely right. You have to think, and you're thinking imaginatively. You're thinking in terms of what do I know? What would be a valid inference? What would it have been like for that person? Obviously, through credible primary and relevant secondary sources. So again, when we talk about primary sources, we're talking about specific documents or materials that were from or from around that time. And then I guess even later in time, if it's really old. Of course, secondary sources are those things about that, right? Credible journalists, scholars, and other researchers. We definitely know with this, if you were really going to dig deeply into this case, there's a voluminous of those materials. However, even if you don't become an expert on the Roanoke colonies, by getting interested in some of this, looking at credible documentaries, grappling with the debate, looking at some of the sources, looking at some of the primary sources, you learn more, which just sort of came out of what we came out of this evening. Okay, just let me, again, there's a range of sources on the National Park Service, and I can't remember if I shared that one already. If I'm redundant with any of them, please let me know. That is what it is. Again, I'm not going to post the USA.gov site. It's obviously going to give you some National Park Service, but there's other material out there potentially or actually from the government, federal, state level. So, that material is out there. Okay, and it's interesting to look in that material. We got a comment here. Kathy, I think it's very possible, at least some of the Roanoke colonists interbred with the Croatoan native peoples. I think, and again, I'm not endorsing any one view, based on what I saw in this video and what I've read elsewhere. And again, not being a DNA expert, but certainly knowledgeable about genealogy in general. And seeing some of the archaeological discussion that Mr. Dawson, Dr. Dawson, Mr. Dawson, whatever, it's important, but whatever is correct, explained, I am leaning strongly to that view that at least some of those folks did that. Obviously, if you go to the idea that there was CRO written on the tree and Croatoan, the word on a post, and if you look at some of the sources where it talks about John White's notes or documents that he were from his time, he didn't see any other. He says it in there, from what I understand, he didn't see any other signs of problems or whatever. Now there are some discussions out there that say, okay, you can build from that those inscriptions to say, okay, were they giving a signal that this is where they were heading? There are some discussions out there that say not so fast, but it is a reasonable place to go. So I think, Kathy, I agree with you for sure. Now, looking at all of these contingencies and scenarios is part of it. And as some sources say, including the First Colony Foundation, and I'm here on one of their articles, New Clues for Lost Colonists 2021, and I'm going to share this link. And again, they give a lot of wonderful references here and just discussions of the various locations, right, and sites. But again, back up to Albemarle Sound, not just Site X, but now a Site Y, and if we're thinking about the possibilities, right? We may never find, and probably won't find, a smoking gun. Maybe we will, but this many years later, it gets very difficult. Because part of that is, I mean, for me, this is a lingering question, um, is, as is discussed in some of these sources, or at least indicated, was it one big group going together, or could there have been a split? Now that gets really difficult. Remember, I believe this was the first expedition to include women and children. Generally. Um, that be, and just for men, obviously, in an area that was not as familiar to them, let alone men, women, and children. That doesn't mean that people didn't necessarily split up, but it's just something to think about. And the newness of the area. Of course, there obviously was information that people had, but then it's just fascinating because you're learning more about these places in just that journey. Any other thoughts? We have about 5 to 10 minutes. Any other thoughts? So I'm going to just go back and summarize again, Roanoke Island. The key years here to think about: 1587. Refer to the various sources I've mentioned or that I've shared there in the chat. And when we distribute this video, the chat will be available. 1587 arrival, again, led by this John White. And again, this is, as you'll see on that one list I shared of people that were on this trip, and even some of the material about Virginia Dare. When you see the word Virginia, keep in mind you're dealing with the Virginia colony. This would be a part of what we later call North Carolina. Carol Ann, pottery was found that some archaeologists believe belonged to the colonists. The pottery was found in an area that some historians believe they wouldn't have gone near unfriendly Indians. That is correct. The overlap here of thinking about the archaeology and the geology and the history and the genealogy and the politics and the tensions of the time. But yes, this is something I would just want to research more. We know that people knew things about the area, but what specifically did people know, especially if they were facing some sort of supply crisis, and what risk would they have been willing to take? This is why, going back to the summary with the History Channel video and more, understanding what the island was like, where they would have settled on the island, where they would have moved on the island, and if they were going through some sort of on the move or escape sort of scenario, looking at the possibilities that some or all of them went north, and or some or all of them went more south to Hatteras Island and the Croatoan people. Part of this too gets into just thinking through objectively and subjectively the realities and importance of human experience, the instincts of survival, trying to take care of each other, trying to deal with those from other cultures or areas. Marty, I think many of the colonists passed away due to harsh conditions. Good point. Those left were either taken in by natives or killed by unfriendly Indians. We can't forget about some of the harsh conditions reality. I might have mentioned that a little bit earlier, right? Just the fact is, hey, if you're just thinking back, right, using our imagination, what we know about history, what we know about it means to be human, someone's on the move, whether they headed north and or south or northwest and or south in those conditions, right? Just like nowadays, even with all of our thoughts that we may have this and might have that, we still run risks, right? And that would raise interesting questions. And then I would want to, of course, would dig more deeply into some of these resources about along the way northwest and along the way south. What has been out there discussed and so forth in terms of remains and so forth, artifacts and so forth that might have been found in those routes, as folks are trying to piece together sort of this bigger picture. With about 3 minutes, can please continue to share any more thoughts. So again, this has been Unfound on the Ground number 26, the disappearance of the Roanoke colonists. Don't forget, again, if you're watching this video, participating now or participating later, watching later, don't forget about the unfoundpodcast.com. Like or share this video, subscribe to the channel. We've covered a lot of great ground. We always are thankful to the think tank folks for their ongoing participation and feedback, right? And we've shared a number of resources for ongoing research for us and for the public, from the History Channel production that In Search Of from about 2019. Material from the government, as well as various scholars and researchers. Again, I'm not endorsing any one view, but I think we've talked about some of what's reasonable. As always, again, in this case, it's not so much that someone out there knows something or knows someone who knows something, but they knew someone or knew someone who knew something. It's a tough one. We can learn more about that through the genealogy, the history, the archaeology, and so forth. I know for myself, as an amateur genealogist who's pretty good at it, I'm not going to necessarily spend right away at this point in my life. In the future, maybe. But if there's one aspect of the case that I'm going to spend some time with, is I'm going to keep up on this genealogy project and use that to learn a little bit more about how the DNA works. Now, sometimes traveling, I'm going to definitely put this area on my list. But I would encourage folks to go ahead and study some of these materials with more depth. For sure, there's a lot of wonderful history here. And thinking about, just in the context of that important and wonderful history, what happened to these folks in terms of their lives and their deaths, and that's important. Because again, on Unfound, we are interested in the truth, the accuracy, and the human element, right? We're not about the sensationalism. If there are no further comments, I'll again thank everyone for participating in Unfound on the Ground number 26. I wish everyone a great week. And as always, when these materials are eventually distributed, certainly you'll know through Ed or myself. Thank you, Leah. Leah, thank you. You're welcome for being a part of it. Kathy, thank you. Carol, Marty, anyone else that was participating. And with that, I'm going to end the episode. Folks, have a great week. Thank you and goodbye. And we have also the real Capella. Let me just acknowledge that too. Thank you, folks. I'll now end the stream.